Hi, everyone. Um, I kind of didn't realize what time it is with the time change. Doesn't it feel like 4 in the afternoon? It's actually 6 o'clock. Um, Please, if you guys want, grab one more quick drink if you need anything before we get started. So, for those of you that don't know, my name is Jen Mason, and I'm the executive director of the Colorado Snowsports Museum. So, thank you for being here. We have a ton of staff here tonight, which is so fun because we're all so excited about this event. Everyone's like, can I work? Can I work? Can I work? And we also have a lot of board members present. So tonight I want to thank all the volunteers and staff that are here. So we have Ron and Holly and Whitney and Ashley, and Cindy was the bartender tonight. So thank you to everyone. Cindy has been a volunteer here since the day the museum opened. We will be celebrating our 50th anniversary in the year 26. So we were started in 1976. So so it's pretty fun. And we have some board members here tonight. We have Chris Anthony still floating around, and then we have Wiley Asher, who's a new board member, and then Trent Bush, who's also presenting tonight. Thank goodness he's here. But he is also here as a board member. Trent's been on the board for since you were 12? Yeah, pretty much when he was 20. So that's pretty incredible. Trent's been on the board for a long time, representing the snowboard community, which is very underrepresented in our sport typically. But I also want to thank the town of Vail. Thank you for free rent, which is wonderful. We would not be able to survive without them. And also they give us a grant. And part of that grant is we are preserving all of these talks. So if you were like, oh my God, my Uncle Joe in Wisconsin would have loved this, you can go onto our YouTube channel and you can send him the link and he can watch this whole presentation. He can fast forward through this part. Because he's not going to listen to this. But so it's pretty incredible. So thank you to the town of Vail for that wonderful grant so that we can properly record all of these. And that's Kaleidoscope who helps us with that. So, and then Westville Liquor Mart gives us a good deal on all the alcohol that we serve. So thank you. So those are our sponsors. And then I just want to thank everyone who's a member, who supports us daily, who's just in here, because without you, the museum would not be open and free to all. And it really is a huge asset to the town of Vail, but it's a huge asset to our entire state of Colorado. People come in here from all over the world, and it's just this incredible museum. And Trent was a big part of the renovation of the museum. So they created this magical, amazing museum that we all get to be in every day. And we get to create these really cool events. So thank you for that. So I'm super excited about tonight because I didn't really think about it till I read the inside cover of Rachel Gross wrote a book called Shopping All the Way to the Woods. And I never thought about it, but before you go outside and get away from everything, you have to buy all the gear. So it's kind of like this conundrum that you're in. Like, you don't want to be wasteful and you want to be really green because that's what's being outdoor. But then you're like, I need 5 coats for this trip today. Some of us don't need 5, but it seems like I always feel like I need 5. Or 5 different pairs of mittens and all these things. So it's pretty incredible. So I'm super excited. And then Trent's going to really bring in everything from a lot of these artifacts. These are mainly his, which is pretty incredible. I'm just really excited for this. I think it's going to be a really cool presentation, and it literally fits our mission exactly what it is. So our mission is really to preserve, educate, and inspire others to seek adventure. So this way maybe maybe we won't buy a new coat next time we go out into the great outdoors. But so now I'm going to introduce Rachel and Trent, and I have 2 microphones so you guys can both speak. And I know this is kind of a pain, but we are recording it, as I've said. So if you could ask a question, if you could either answer the question within the question, but within your answer, or just repeat the question, because the people, when they go to watch it, like Uncle Joe in Wisconsin, he won't know what the question was. So thanks. So that's Trent Bush, and this is Rachel Gross. You can come on up.
All right. Thank you, Jen, and to the whole team for helping to make this evening possible. As you might imagine, as a gear enthusiast, I'm delighted to be surrounded by cool historic artifacts and people who share that interest with me. The way we're going to structure this talk is that I'm going to speak a bit about the background of the book and the kind of broad questions about kind of the challenges and joys that dealing with outdoor gear can bring. I'll go into some of the history of ski wear in the United States in the first half of the 20th century, and then Trent is going to pick it up after that with more local history of Colorado and especially Boulder and some names that you might recognize. Okay. So I had only been backpacking for one night in my life when I won a fellowship that was going to take me backpacking around the world for a year by myself. And I knew that besides going to the library to get a bunch of guidebooks for all the trails I was planning to hike, that the very first stop would have to be my local outdoor store. I'm from Southern California. That was Adventure 16, a now defunct store that only had a few locations in Los Angeles and San Diego. I knew this because I had spent my childhood reading Boys Life magazine, the Boy Scout handbooks, watching clips of kind of outdoor adventures, and being exposed to beautiful art and literature of the Romantic era of the United States, all of which taught me that the way to be most myself was to get outside and to get back to nature. I had learned the lessons from these activities, from this exposure to American culture, essentially, that if I wanted to be brave, self-reliant, adventurous, that like the characters of My Side of the Mountain by Jean Craig George or Hatchet by Gary Paulson, I had to go live outdoors. I had to climb mountains. I had to kind of race down them and to really understand who I was, but also to show off the kind of person that I wanted to be. And so what I thought is that I was going to go hiking around the world for a year, and I was going to have all the right stuff so that no one would know I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. Of course, I chose all the wrong things when I went shopping. I had a new orange Capilene rain jacket and new hiking boots, all of which worked fine, but I didn't know how to work my stove when it broke. My spork broke in half, and I was cold every night when I was sleeping outdoors. It took months for me to understand the reason for that was my sleeping bag was fine. The cold was actually seeping up from the ground. It was my sleeping pad that wasn't good enough. Over many months, I kind of engaged with people on the trail in lots of different countries as I went hiking, and they all had questions for me like, why did you pack so much stuff? And why did you pack those things? Why didn't you bring these other ones that I personally think are better? Now, as you might expect, there's some level of condescension in people addressing a 22-year-old by herself on the trail who probably doesn't know that much about what she's doing. But I actually learned that there was something a lot more interesting going on in those conversations. It was that these folks on the trails and outdoor recreation areas all over the world were sharing with me their vision of how to get back to nature the right way, right? Their ideas about what goes on a packing list, the things that you need not just to survive, but to feel comfortable or at home or to look the part. And in Patagonia or in Switzerland, those styles, those aesthetics are somewhat different. So I took these questions about what is the right stuff that you need to look the part of an outdoors person, and I started to think, gosh, maybe the lessons that I learned as a kid from the Boy Scout handbook and all the other material wasn't the truth, but rather just one way of thinking about how to get back to nature, right? I thought it was the right way, but it turns out to be a product of American culture in the 19th and 20th century. And so I took those lessons with me to graduate school. I went on to study history at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, so hi to Uncle Joe or whoever in Wisconsin. I began to ask, essentially, why do Americans go shopping when they're trying to get back to nature? And when I say back to nature, I include all forms of outdoor sports in their historic and contemporary sense. So that would include things like outdoor sports of the early 20th century, think driving, camping, hunting, and fishing, all of which counted as when Abercrombie and Fitch sold to those categories in the early 1920s and 30s. But also more modern sports from mountain biking to snowboarding to kayaking, where people buy a whole bunch of stuff, both because they need it in order to survive and do the activity, but also because they love gear, just like I do, and want to look the part of somebody who belongs, who knows what they're doing, and who has a kind of insider status because they're wearing the right brand on their chest pocket. I did not become the outdoor adventurer my younger self had envisioned. I spent my time in libraries and archives rather than on mountaintops, which is just fine with me, actually. Instead, I became the first historian of the outdoor industry that I know of anyone claiming that title. That means that I investigate not just the changes in technologies, the product innovations over the last 150 years of history in this country, but also the meanings that Americans attach to these goods, right? So not just what stuff did they buy, which is a pretty straightforward and dry business history, but why do they love it so much? Why, in basements and attics all around the country, are there stacks of 50-year-old or older pieces of gear that people no longer use but simply can't get rid of because they love it so much and it means so much to them about where they came from, the activities that they were a part of? As somebody who also shares that enthusiasm, I wanted to understand both the stuff, but also the relationship that consumers had to it and why they attached so much of their identity, who they were, to those particular products. So I wrote this book over the last 15 plus years, Shopping All to the Way to the Woods, How the Outdoor Industry Sold Nature to America, where I examine the evolution of the industry, its origins in the days after the Civil War, when the very first outdoor recreationists, which means people who were doing these things for fun, not out of necessity, began to acquire goods or make them themselves, as often is the case, to the dawn of the kind of very first national companies with their mail order catalogs in the early 20th century, to the influence of the US military on the outdoor industry during World War II, and then of course the boom years of the 1970s, when outdoor specialty retailers popped up all over the country, selling goods for the first time to a set of consumers who might never had had access to them before. As many of you likely know, the outdoor industry is big business in the 21st century. It's around 2% of GDP, which makes it a significant industry. And that means that our leisure time enthusiasms, right, these interests that we share as people who love to be outside and active in some way, actually are economically and politically quite important to modern America. And so this book is an attempt to explain how that came to be and kind of the meanings that people attached as they told attached to gear as they told stories about why it mattered so much in US history and in the contemporary moment. So that's some background on the book itself. I put together this research over the course of visits to archives and libraries all over the country, more than 15 states is the way to tell this kind of story. It means that it's a story focused mostly on the American West, but it has its origins out east because that's where the industry in the US mostly began. Colorado plays a significant role, as you might imagine, in this history of the national industry. I'm going to focus a bit on the national story now because we're getting from Trent more of that local orientation and a special kind of look at the brands and the relationships that folks who lived in Colorado had to those brands. So I'm going to take you back to the early 20th century. One of the most interesting things that I found when looking at the catalogs and other ephemera from outdoor companies in the early 20th century was the way that outdoor companies learned to sell authentic outdoor experience to their readers or their consumers. And that was by suggesting that the clothes that they sold were built for work, not for play. What I mean by that is Hirschweiss and similar companies in the early 20th century consistently advertised their authentic experience by saying, we got our start as workwear companies. We may now be selling ski clothes, which indeed they did, but you can trust us because we built clothes that worked for men who labored outside. It's a move that actually might sound familiar, right? If you have recognized the Carhartt trends of the last 15 plus years, something stylish you might find on a young person walking the streets of Berlin, you know that American workwear brands have actually significant power, right? They're a part of Americana and they have international appeal. I thought that was something new in the 21st century. It turns out it's more than 100 years old, that kind of attempt to tell a story of the American past through outdoor clothing and a story about outdoor work. So Max and Harold Hirsch, a father and son team, acquired Willamette Tent and Awning Company around the turn of the 20th century that had mostly sold, as you might expect, tents. Like they had basically an expertise in canvas. This father and son pair transformed the company to a workwear company first, and then later to a sports-oriented company selling both hunting gear and ski clothing by the 1920s and 1930s. The Stag Cruiser, a wool jacket, was one of the most popular styles of the 1920s, and it illustrates this narrative of how to sell a kind of idea of the authentic kind of outdoor experience that ski companies were using in their advertising and other kinds of narratives. So here we have the original and famous, as they call it, in the Hirsch-Weiss catalog, Stag Cruiser. It was a heavy coat. It came down kind of to the mid-thigh. It was made out of wool, and it came in very bright colors. This one's red, but there was also a very lovely green that I have an image of that you'll see in just a moment. The two main selling points of the Stag Cruiser was functionality and comfort. It mattered, of course, that it felt good on your body, but really what matters is that it worked outside. You weren't going to die if you wore this and then went to participate in whatever activities you were about to do, and that matters to the consumers who are reading it. In one of the catalogs, Max Hirsch wrote about this functionality. He said, "In the Pacific Northwest, there is a hardy group of outdoor men who demand the utmost in clothes, complete weather protection and bodily freedom." He goes on to explain that the Stags were designed exactly for those customers. The advertisements also recreated kind of this mythology of the history of workwear when they were selling sports clothes. So here you have an advertisement, and the text on the bottom is faint, so I'll read it for you. It says, "Stags are built for outdoor work." This is an advertisement for a ski jacket, but the point here is showing that historically somebody might have sat on a tractor wearing something very similar, and that was how they convinced you this is good stuff and you know you can trust the brand. There are other versions of this that I also enjoy. I'll read the text for here as well. This is also an advertisement for the ski jacket, the Stag Cruiser. "The call of the outdoors. There is a Hirsch-Weiss Stag for every outdoor activity. Built for action and service, they are the ideal garments for those happy hours when work and care are left behind." So what's notable about this is that you can hear in the language of the advertisement this idea that it's workers who are really going to give it the stamp of approval, but that's not at all what's happening in terms of the consumers themselves. So you have a golfer, a skier, and then somebody smoking a pipe, all emblems, of course, of leisure, outdoors, and in, I would imagine. Customers wrote into the company to talk about how much they loved these Stag Cruisers. So they define themselves basically as discriminating consumers who really understand what was a good product, and they would tell the company about that. A good example of this is a man named Harold Baumberger, who was a hunter in Pennsylvania in the 1920s. And he wrote a postcard basically to his friends saying, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Hey guys, I got a new jacket, it's great, and I can't wait till you see me wearing it." And though the language was of the 1920s, the sentiment to me was so remarkable because it sounded just like me, right? When I got something new that I was excited to show off, I would tell people, "Oh, like, yeah, I got this. It was on sale," or like, "Feel this fabric, it's really light." Whatever the kind of the specific thing I was eager to share, it turns out that American consumers for more than 100 years have been making similar kinds of moves. The Stag Cruisers allowed Hirsch-Weiss to expand much deeper into the recreational market in the 1920s. So much so that the younger Hirsch, Harold, when he went to Dartmouth, began selling versions of this ski jacket, another kind of Stag Cruiser, to his classmates by going dorm room to dorm room around the campus. Eventually, there was a local outdoor company that said, "Okay, if you stop doing that, if you stop taking away our skier customers, who are all these college students, we'll sell your company's, your Hirsch-Weiss jacket in the store instead." So that was one way that this West Coast-based company was able to expand to a more national market. It was around this time that Hirsch-Weiss decided to change the company name to White Stag, a name that you might actually recognize. It's a translation from German. Harold Hirsch and his father, his father was German originally. They were also Jewish, and so they were quite sensitive to kind of the association of kind of their company name with their Jewish identity. And though there was a kind of a substantial set of Jewish businessmen in the clothing business in Portland, Oregon, to go for this national and recreational market, specifically with a focus on skiing, they didn't want their company to be associated with their religion. And so they changed it to White Stag, a name that it seems like folks recognize now. Though Hirsch felt profoundly out of place in Dartmouth as an outdoor enthusiast, but most especially as a Jew, he had some success in figuring out the future of his company. He did get an education in marketing. He recognized that the outerwear that his father's company was selling, when it was marketed as this kind of mix of workwear and sportswear, could be very successful indeed. Hirsch had intended to study sociology or anthropology at Oxford after graduating from Dartmouth, but instead his father called him back after 1929 and said, hey, our company's not going to make it unless you come back to work here. So it turned out that he never got to pursue that life. He instead became the head eventually of his family business, White Stag, and went on to be a leader in Portland's outdoor industry for years to come. Until the 1930s, most American ski clothing looked like it had been imported from Scandinavia or from some alpine region. And this extends to not just its design, but also kind of the gimmicks, right? The cute embroidery that you might find when it comes to Edelweiss flowers on a jacket lapel or something similar. So that was a strong aesthetic contrast to the far more conservative two-tone design that you see with the ski jacket behind me, and that was an important shift. And you can see in this excellent display of ski wear throughout the years that's to my right, some of the evolutions in outdoor, especially ski style, and how it relates to broader fashions and how sometimes it's about functionality. One of the things that I found over and over in my research is that both consumers and outdoor industry professionals alike were really eager to shun any kind of notion that what they were selling or consuming was about style, right? They always wanted to emphasize, we are buying this stuff because it works. We're selling it because it's functional. And yet, for more than 100 years, the stylishness of outdoor wear has mattered very deeply. Of course, that was the reason that Teddy Roosevelt himself, when he bought a fringed buckskin jacket from a Native American woman and then posed for it in a New York studio, it was the reason that he acquired it. It wasn't because he needed it, of course, he was going back east, but he wanted to look the part of a rugged outdoorsman in the American West. And so he acquired the style of the day to symbolize that kind of reputation. In many ways, the ski wear here that I'm talking about with White Stag or Hirsch Weiss, and what you see on display over here and what we'll talk more about, is deeply functional. It worked very well, and there have been, of course, improvements over time, though not quite as many as you would hope. But I actually think that one of the lessons of this research for me has been how much style, right, popular fashions is a part of what we consume, even if it's for sports and seems to be on the surface all about functionality. Harold Hirsch developed a new brand name and logo that would make the new name stick in customers' minds. So here you can see the White Stag branding. This is from the inside of a jacket. Two skiers skiing down a mountain on the side. The stag logo still adorns Portland's Oregon skyline, so you can see kind of the White Stag over Portland still if you travel over there. Hirsch Weiss had already been using this image of the leaping deer in advertisements and catalogs in the 20s, but the White Stag really got emphasized as a part of the brand's reputation when they made this name switch at the end of the decade. The other important way that White Stag / Hirsch Weiss used history was not just emphasizing the origins of this ski wear company in workwear, but also by emphasizing just how Western it truly was. Now, you'll recall that the Willamette Tent and Awning Company, the original version of this company, sold experts in canvas. And so why do you see a cowboy right here? basically, what I found in these advertisements is a real embrace for a nostalgia of the American Western frontier, a nostalgia for a vision of the American past that never really existed, but was recreated over and over again through advertisements like this one. So here you see a silhouette of a cowboy on horseback, kind of backed by a lovely mountain. It looks kind of like it could be Glacier, but honestly, it could be anywhere. The stag idea, born in the West for action. And then the text below essentially says, made to meet the demands of the woodsman, stags retain these qualities and now they can be used for all sorts of activities. There's something really interesting going on in this advertisement about pushing a vision of the American past. The Stag Cruiser, when you go skiing, doesn't need to be linked to a cowboy on horseback. That's certainly not where the company got its start, right? The origin of the jacket isn't there. And yet the deeper mythology of being a rugged outdoors person, self-reliant, brave, adventurous, the very qualities I had hoped to realize through my outdoor activities after reading Boys Life magazine in the 1990s are emphasized in this advertisement from the 1920s and 1930s. In other words, there's a repeat over many decades of the notion that buying certain kinds of outdoor gear, though seemingly all about function, right? Do they work well as you're skiing down this slope? Do they keep you warm if you're sleeping outdoors? Are actually about not just style, right? Do they look good? But do they connect you to a certain vision of your nation's past? Do they say something about who you are as a person individually, but who you are as a part of a larger nation? That's a really powerful image to consider if all you're trying to do is, of course, just buy a ski jacket. I'm going to transition now to the second part of my historic story before we get to the Colorado-specific stuff in just a couple of minutes. This was the story I was just telling is a history of the 1920s and 1930s. In 1939, as many of you know, as the US was contemplating potentially entering the conflict in Europe, they were looking to Europe's mountain troops and realizing that there was very little cold weather expertise in the US military. And they turned to skiers, mountaineers, and people who worked in the outdoor industry. The story of skiers, especially the ski patrol, but certainly even recreational skiers, and the role that they played in influencing the 10th Mountain Division, the leadership they went on to have in the recreational world in the decades that followed is very well known and beautifully told in this museum, in History Colorado and many other places. What is less well known is the influence of outdoor industry professionals who are already doing this kind of work in the first half of the 20th century and how they shaped the Quartermaster Corps, the division of the US military that essentially helped to create and pass out all of the uniforms and equipment that soldiers all over the world needed. So that's what I'm going to talk about here, is putting that 10th Mountain Division story in a bigger context and explaining what that means for our consumption of outdoor goods even in the 21st century. This is what the US military had when it came to cold weather clothing, uniforms and equipment in 1939. They were quite concerned that they didn't have the expertise, so they sought out famous names of the day. L.L. Bean, Eddie Bauer, and Harold Hirsch were among those who received the call from the head of the Quartermaster Corps, the Quartermaster General, saying, hey, you need to come to Washington and be on our civilian advisory board and help us figure out what we're doing. Part of what they recommended was doing test expeditions at Camp Hale, partly, but also Mount Rainier in Alaska. And on these test expeditions, the US military would test the best available civilian products alongside what the US military had. So here we have LL Bean utility parka and ski parka, and then the comparison, if you looked on the next page, would be essentially, here's what the military is already producing, what do people think? And here it was skiers, mostly mountaineers, who were able to make these evaluations. These documents are part of the 10th Mountain Division collection, right? Because originally this influx of outdoor expertise was directed at the ski troopers, but it turned out to have an influence not just on the 10th Mountain Division, but on the US Army as a whole. This story is important because it essentially shows how civilian knowledge about equipping people to survive outside got passed on to 12 million soldiers during the war, but also influenced civilian consumers at the same time. So Harold Hirsch was one of these civilian advisors. He had expertise making ski jackets for the most part, though his family company's origins was in all sorts of canvas goods. When he was in Washington, he would see the new ways of designing and testing clothing. The M43 jacket, which was what the soldiers were clothed in beginning in 1944, was a part of a broader system of essentially layering, right? Not something that seems revelatory to us at this day and age, but for a lot of folks who didn't live in mountainous or cold weather environments, the idea that you should wear many thin layers that you could take off or put on when you needed to, depending on how active you were, was actually something new. Certainly it was new in the US military, where the World War I greatcoats, those heavy wool jackets that went down to your knee, were the standard of the day. It was outdoors people, right, professionals and athletes alike, who helped the US military make the shift to more thin layers rather than just those heavy jackets. This had an influence on what White Stag was selling to consumers even during the war itself. So this is an advertisement from one of those catalogs during the war. This says, basically based on the famous Army field jacket, the M43, or this is a different version of a military jacket. These designs were directly available to US consumers as long as they were made out of fabrics like cotton that weren't being controlled by the War Production Board. Here's another example of how this information and this expertise got passed from the industry to the US military and then back again. White Stag, or Hirsch Weiss Manufacturing Company, put out these advertisements showing off their role in clothing ski troopers or other soldiers who had to survive in these kinds of conditions, and suggested that though we are serving the nation for the duration, right, during the war itself, this is stuff that's going to be available to regular outdoor enthusiasts in the years that follow. And so there are advertisements like this for all sorts of outdoors brands. Eddie Bauer is another one that had a central role in equipping folks in the Army Air Force, and even we can see this with Coleman stoves, right? Basically suggesting like, look, these pocket stoves that so many soldiers are using right now, soon you'll be making hot chocolate on these stoves with your families when you go camping after the war. And so you can see that the outdoor industry professionals are looking ahead to the years after the conflagration, when they're recognizing there will be a civilian market, newly flush with all these wartime funds, able to purchase more recreational goods. And that brings us essentially to the rest of the story that we're going to talk about with Trent. In the years after World War II, outdoor companies were transformed by the influence of the scientific testing and the layering system of the US military, but also by something that has been left out of the story of the great contributions of the 10th Mountain Division. And that is the fact that not just ski troopers, but all sorts of veterans, all sorts of soldiers went on to be a part of the outdoor industry by reselling military surplus, right? How many here have been to an Army surplus store at some point in their lives? Though I've never purchased gear to go skiing in from a surplus store, this was the most popular way to equip yourself both for winter and summer activities in the years after World War II. And there was a very good reason for this. It was cheap and it was everywhere, right? Of course, military surplus didn't fit all bodies, right? The biggest thing I heard was that it was too heavy and it was too big for most American consumers, but it was in towns that had never had access to specialty retailer, right? If you lived in Boulder, you probably could have gotten very nice outdoor equipment and clothing, but not if you lived in Kansas or Nebraska or all sorts of other places. And now there were a military surplus store making accessible the amazing and scientifically tested and kind of mountaineer-proven goods that had been available only to soldiers during the war, and they were available for resale for not that much money. The flood of initial excellent Army surplus didn't last through the 1950s. Soon it was imitation surplus that took its place. But the effect of the US military's kind of flood of goods was that far more Americans were now exposed to the notion that you should buy stuff in order to participate in these activities. Rather than making do with just sleeping on the ground, it was possible to buy a tent and a sleeping bag. And even if they weren't the best ever, that became the new standard of how people engage with outdoor sports. They acquired more of these goods because they were more accessible and more affordable than they ever had been before. Among those many folks who started outdoor companies, either through reselling Army surplus or coming up with their own designs, were two really important figures in Colorado's history, Leroy Holubar and Jerry Cunningham. And that is where I'm going to turn it over now to Trent to talk to us about the years after World War II, when Boulder became a hub of innovation in the outdoor industry. So,
cool.
Take it away.
Thank you. And I'll ask Rachel to interject, because she's done all the actual historical stuff, and I've just been along for the ride. So, oh, typo, cool. Yeah, first slide, that's perfect. Yeah, sorry, I had to do this morning, and I was out of commission the last few days, so if my voice is a little soft, apologies in advance. So, Jerry Cunningham, Jerry and Ann Cunningham, so they were very, very important in the overall history of the outdoor industry, and we'll kind of touch on that as we go through. But Jerry was 10th Mountain Division. So he came back, he actually joined the 10th Mountain Division, and you're going to have to keep me out of jail if any of this is wrong. He joined the 10th Mountain Division in large part because he was already a skier on the East Coast, and he wanted to go and not only help the country, but he also really wanted to have the best gear and have access to all the greatest stuff. And so one of his biggest things that he learned in World War II was that the stuff was actually not the greatest stuff, because he had on his own, not only in ski, but also in hiking and backpacking and all kinds of things in the pre-war times. So,
and I'll just add to that he wrote about lying in his tent, drawing better designs than the military could come up with themselves, and that was kind of what inspired him in many ways to become what he called the L.L. Bean of the West. He moved to Boulder in '46 and decided that that's exactly what he was going to do with his improved designs, much better than the 10th Mountain Division could have provided.
Yeah, and so he came back from the war and decided, that stuff was terrible, so I'm going to innovate and I'm going to create my own stuff. And Jerry was a true innovator. And so I'll just, as I kind of talk through this, I'll just show you a couple of the artifacts and things that I have, that we'll have in the museum's collection, but also things I have in my personal collection. And then we'll talk at some point, I'll kind of tell you how I figure into the whole story and kind of this legacy sort of idea and the through line sort of mentality. But this is if you've seen around the corner right here, there's the 10th Mountain Soldier with the cotton canvas anorak. And so this was Jerry's first anorak. He came back from the war and tried to improve on it. And nylon was a relatively new invention. So it still has cotton drawstrings and that kind of thing. So it was really a lot of the same pieces and parts, just done in modern materials, which is super cool. He was an incredible innovator, not only in apparel. He did climbing. If you know avalanche probes, he was the inventor of the avalanche probe in general, making them out of aluminum. He created aluminum tent poles for tents. He was the first one to do that. He created the cord lock, if you guys know the cord lock, which is the little thing on the end of cords that keep it, and just so many different things. And he and his wife, and they also really lived up in Ward, right above Boulder, and were one of the very first outdoor companies. They did mail order first, just post-war, and actually got their start selling using the National Ski Patrol, which he was part of their mailing list to send catalogs out to everybody there. They were part of the first successful Everest trip with Sir Edmund Hillary. Was that in '52, I think? They supplied sleeping bags for that, and then they also supplied the first U.S. Jim Whittaker's expedition, supplying jackets that they actually had to fly in with helicopters to get to base camp because the stuff that they had taken wasn't working, so they had to call that in. They also outfitted the U.S. Olympic Committee in 1964 when they really started making things specifically for skiing. This jacket was called the Slope Coat. So that is, this one obviously has the Denver 76 patch on it, which never came to fruition. But this was their first foray into insulated ski wear, which is also really interesting. So, you know, the effect he had on, and Anne, of course, and their family, had on early outdoor history really can't be overstated, but also the 10th Mountain Connection, and then all of the things that they did. I mean, this is also a Jerry jacket, this National Ski Patrol jacket. I mean, they were making all these things. They were sewing them down in Ward and in Boulder and around the Front Range for many, many years. Do you have anything maybe interesting to add to that?
Yeah, I think when it comes to understanding the argument I make about the meanings that people attach to stuff, so not just does it work, right? It has to do with the relationships that both Jerry and Ann, and then as you'll hear, Leroy and Alice Hollybar developed with their consumer base. It mattered a whole lot that they were expert themselves, participants in the very activities that they were creating for. And it mattered too that they invited people into their homes and kind of spoke with them one-on-one about their product needs, design, customization, and the like. I think this has kind of a really big role in shaping kind of post-war attitudes about the right way to equip yourself, which is to say, it wasn't just this jacket or that one, but also, did you know these folks, the Cunninghams, the Hollybars, personally? Had you spoken with them? Had they made something just for you? That too could be a sign of belonging and expertise in the way that earlier in the 20th century, those connections wouldn't have existed.
Yeah, exactly. And so they were a very, very influential early brand, and you can trace a lot of outdoor industry, a lot of the later ski industry, directly to Jerry Hollybar and Frostline, we'll be talking about in the next slide. But the thing about Jerry is, which is really interesting, if you see this logo, Costco actually sells Jerry product now. And so you'll see people out on the street with the G and with the Jerry, and nobody knows the story, nobody knows the lineage and any of the history. So it's just really interesting how some of those brands are revived later on because they do have that true outdoor and ski heritage. So at the same time, also in Boulder, Hollybar. So Leroy and Alice Hollybar were high school sweethearts he was a math professor at CU Boulder. And she actually was really the person who ran, in so many ways, the Hollybar company. As Rachel talked about, you know, at the turn of sort of that post-war time, everything was either like a surplus, as you were talking about, or there was really a lot of Europe. And so they started their first catalog, which was up here in, was it 50 or was it 40? No, it was 46.
Yeah, so like so many other companies, Hollybar Mountaineering started because Leroy was reselling his brother-in-law's surplus goods. Yeah, it was only veterans who had access to purchasing the lots of goods from the U.S. military directly, so to get them cheaply. And so he had access through, though he was a civilian, he had access that way, and that's how the company got started.
Yeah, and so influential. They brought in the first, if you know, Vibram soles for hiking boots and that kind of thing. They actually imported the soles, and down in Boulder, you could send your boots in, and Perry's shoe shop would actually trade out the soles instead of the big heavy lug soles with the nails in the bottom that didn't work on rock. And back then, they were really pioneering alpinism and climbing in Colorado, in Boulder, all around the world. And those types of climbing footwear didn't work when you have the heavy cleats coming out of the bottom. As I said, they were high school sweethearts. They were actually valedictorian and salutatorian of Prep Owl, that's Boulder High, which used to be called State Prep School. And so this is where I start hearing, again, I wasn't around in the 30s. My grandparents went to school with them. I'm fourth generation Boulder. My family came to Colorado in 1892, I believe. And so I've, the outdoor thing and the boulder thing, living there now still and having grown up there, has been sort of really near and dear to my heart. So for me to hear about Jerry and to hear about Hollybar, and to hear all these different stories, because it was really part and parcel to my family coming. They were all miners and sort of did that transition of where the outerwear you wore was for your job or kept you alive, and then it kind of changed to being a real recreational sort of pursuit. So Hollybar, Jerry were incredibly important in the Boulder area, but they were also became nationally famous and really the drivers of bringing the right gear, especially to alpinists across the country.
I have something to add to that. One of the stories that I was very surprised by that I found in the archives was when basically as a part of the 1962 exposition in Moscow, Hollybar was invited to display some of their products in the basically recreational section of that show. And so they were able to mail to Russia or to the USSR a down sleeping bag, some kind of climbing hard other products, and they wrote a letter that says, "Greetings to the Russian people. Here's this stuff that we made," and they basically explained kind of the American enthusiasm for the wilderness and why people would go outside and kind of spend all of this time on a mountainside, and how it was a family craft business that had created all of these goods. That's interesting to me in part because this is the same international event that's known for the kitchen debates, right? When Nixon and Khrushchev are talking about the differences between the American and Russian system, and Nixon is very eager to show, look at that the American housewife has in her kitchen, right? That's what they were talking about. And as a part of that display, right, we also see that one another American emblem is not just a washing machine, but also a sleeping bag, right? Materials for going mountaineering. And that's notable also because, of course, the USSR had its own legacy of highly accomplished climbers, and it's not as though any of these activities would have been that foreign. But to American gear producers, right, I think they thought that it was uniquely American, or they saw only the Western European connection, but rather than understanding it in this broader international context. So suggesting these are really renowned companies, not just local Colorado stories. It had international ripple effects through things like the exposition in Moscow.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And some of the things, I mean, even just popular culture. I mean, the Hollybar mountain jacket, Mork, if you guys remember Mork and Mindy, Deer Hunter, right? It was that jacket, that 60-40, 60% nylon, 40% cotton sort of fabric was just really ubiquitous in that post-war outdoor industry, and also the ski industry as well. Hollybars, as I said, they brought in a lot of European imports over the years, and after we're done, you can come up and look at some of this cool stuff. But they were actually in Boulder as early as the late 40s, so 10 years before Yvon Chouinard was making them. Who actually, Yvon Chouinard was actually inspired, as were many, many brands by, and Yvon Chouinard, of course, is Patagonia, if you guys don't know that. But he was in Boulder a lot, and the Hollybar home, which was at 1215 Grandview on the hill, so University Hill in Boulder, just a block off the university and right above Boulder High, or above the stadium, that became almost a club for alpinists in the United States, and people would come from far and wide and come and have a meal and make a jacket or watch a jacket or a sleeping bag being made. And it was really just a really welcoming thing, which is actually interesting because when you talk back to even Jerry, one of the employees, early employees when Jerry actually left, maybe it was one of the two, went and started Adventure A13 in California, which is where you found your stuff. So it's just really interesting, all of these different connections and how deep they actually go. That's pretty cool. That's Eldora, if you guys ever skied Eldora in Boulder, but that was there. but they did. They made as well. So what was really happening then, as Hollybar, as Jerry really were taking off, as I said, all you could really get were either the leftovers from World War II or European imports. And so they did start making their own product, as we talked about, and innovating in jackets and in tents and sleeping bags and packs and all these different things. The problem was they were really, really expensive. European imports were really expensive. The US surplus was no good, but cheap. And it was really hard, especially in the late 60s, early 70s. The economy wasn't great, and outdoor equipment and gear was really difficult and really hard to get. So, sorry, I have one more slide here. This was Boulder as well. I just wanted to talk about Leroy Hollybar in general. He was really influential in the ski industry as well. I think Jerry, of course, was 10th Mountain and did all the work with the National Ski Patrol and innovated all these things. Really involved in Boulder's and early Colorado ski history as well. A lot of people don't know that Chautauqua and Boulder, that's the third Flatiron right there, or the first Flatiron, I guess, that used to be a ski area long, long ago when it snowed more, and they had a rope tow, and they had a ski jump. And Leroy Hollybar also helped get the CU ski jump that's in Boulder Canyon up at Rogers Park going, and also put a rope tow, helped putting some rope tows in it. Allens Park ski jump back in the day. So again, very, very influential in the early ski history as well of Colorado. So going back to the gear question, things were really expensive or just really not that great. And so what happened late in Jerry, in the Jerry piece, one of the people who actually helped run Jerry, two of the people, Dale and Julie Johnson, were early Boulder people, and did a lot. Julie was one of the main sewers for Jerry, and Dale was actually, I think he was vice president at one point for a number of years. They had started trying to make some kits, clothing and kits that would be more affordable. Everybody had a sewing machine back in the day, and so like this vest, for instance, is a Frostline vest, and everybody knew how to sew, or everybody in most households had sewing machines. And so it wasn't that far of a leap to say, hey, we could save you a lot of money. You could customize, you could make the fit exactly what you want, and you could actually outfit your entire family for the price of one European imported down jacket. So Dale left Jerry. What they were doing at Jerry were making kits that were really just schematics, and you had to scale things up and use graph paper and cut it all out yourself and all these different things. So what Dale's big breakthrough was to actually create the kits that you actually would make and sell in kit form. So I can pass this around. I don't know if you guys want to see it. That's a ski jacket. That one's from the late 70s. So that was a really big breakthrough. Dale was also famous for a few other reasons. He was the guy that first painted the C on the Flatiron with a bucket of paint in the 1940s, for better or for worse. And he also climbed the Flatiron in roller skates just to get some, to get a little rise out of people. But he was a real character. And so that's kind of where I sort of start to figure into this and my own sort of front row seat and experience. My dad, who's Bob Bush right there, that's NCAR. If you guys know NCAR, it's the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder. Really famous building. But he was one of the first employees, actually. He was there opening day. He worked there in the technical drafting department. And these are all his friends that worked with him. They couldn't afford okay. Everything on site. They had a fabrication lab, and they had a 60-40 cloth. They pack frames, so they're out there showing who took the picture. you know, stuff. Um, they bottom on Gillespie Drive, which is right at the bottom of kind of where you drive up to. And that we just talked about. This guy right here just drove. You know, it's just like, oh, well, I just made this tent, and Dale was just started. We're actually, you know, he kind of talked about Jerry and that stuff, but on the spot. So my dad actually went in as well. Crossline became a in the early outdoor industry, doing technical manuals and all the instruction booklets for home. It became this sort of family affair. So when I'm guessing I was probably 4 years old. I think my brother was a little older. That's me, and then. You can pass that around too and take a look, but that was the thing. So right here, my mom. Skateboards. So skateboards. My so you guys nylon in the basement down. You know, their slogan was "Get your kit together." It was so your own gear. You can make any if ski bag. Yeah. Is the ski bag, yeah. So it was created for junior highs and middle schools and that kind of thing, and high schools. So kids would actually get these little kits. I actually made a skateboard repertoire, but and learn school and more right there. The other, the interesting thing is filled, so these little bags expand greatly. Each kit would have a depending. This where these bags were, and we were talking about this, Wiley. Yardstick, if you guys remember yardsticks, the wood yardsticks, and there's a very special to and stick to basically turn this bag inside out within the baffle and pull, and only have half of the down escape the bag, which always kind of seemed to be the deal.
If I can just interject for a second. So some things to consider when thinking about the broader context in which Frostline operated. Frostline was the originator and the real leader in the outdoor kit industry nationally, and influenced the entry of many other companies into a similar market. And so though there were no other kits at the start of the Frostline era, within 10 years, there were, by my count, more than 12 other outdoor companies making similar products. Jerry had them. So did the co-op, what became REI. Sundown, and many, many others. This was, of course, kind of part of a broader trend of kit making, or the DIY culture of the 1970s, and so you would have seen the Frost line and similar kits advertised in the Whole Earth catalog, right? It was a part of the ethos of appropriate technology and would have shown up as kind of a notion of how you're going to survive or do things yourself. One of the interesting aspects of the kind of gender dimensions of putting together kits at home is that though many folks were educated in how to sew at a rudimentary level, it was mostly women who were putting together these kits, though they were advertised equally to men and to women. I think this is an important part of the story, though it sounds like we have a whole range of kind of former kit sewers in the room, which is awesome. Most of the people who I interviewed who talked about this, men and women, would say, you know, like, oh, I made this jacket for mountaineering, or I made these bike panniers, or whatever it might be. When I asked the men how they put it together, they said, well, actually, my mom did it. Or actually, I went to the neighbor's house and I just sewed a couple stitches and then she did the rest of it. And I don't actually think that's meant to be much of a critique. Certainly the women who I talked to who said, yeah, I sewed things for my whole family, and every Christmas everyone was getting a Frostline vest or something else, weren't complaining about it. I just wanted to reflect on the notion that part of what people talk about when they remember the kit era was the era of customization, the fierce independence they felt in putting things together for themselves, but misremembering, because a lot of the kind of the evidence suggests that the guys who talk about it in that way didn't actually do the sewing themselves. Something else that's interesting about the Frostline kind of heyday of the 1970s is that though it had its dominance because of its expertise in catalogs, right, in mail order fulfillment, that Frostline started to open in-person stores around the country with basically like sewing experts who would answer your phone calls, or you could go talk to in person, because it was actually not easy to sew a kit if you didn't already know what you were doing. And so Backpacker magazine ran a review of one of these kits, and they called it the 400-hour parka. And while an expert sewer could absolutely put together an entire jacket in a weekend, not everyone could. And so there's some mixed memories of how this era operated, right, depending on the skill and enthusiasm that you brought to it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the giving, they'd have the sewing machine set up, and people could bring in their half-finished kits and get some. If it was full there. Then finally, the people would be the ones taking the money, and my brother back to the down and making sure that all the down was right for the people. So lately, line, and then of course, this became second nature for me as well. Yeah, these are the some of the sleeping bags. That's me. Big sticks we were holding up to make sure that the sleeping bags were straight. Hardcore skiers, I mean, as hardcore as you can be at 8 or whatever that is. We loved it. He loved it. Boulder not only was a sort of hotbed, of course, of the outdoor industry, but also the ski industry. By that time, Spider had started, I think 1978 maybe. Dave Jacobs started that. Hansen Boots, Lovett Skis, Head was pressing skis in Boulder. I mean, there was a whole lot of Boulder ski history happening at the time. So thinking back to that photo where I refused to be in the photo if I didn't stand on my skateboard, my dad and my family and my grandparents and great-grandparents and all that it was hiking, camping, fishing, backpacking, all those cool things. Like any good kid, I rebelled, and I found snowboarding. Well, I found skateboarding first, and then snowboarding became this thing. Growing up in Boulder, again, there were the sledding hill, there were snurfers around. We were standing up on sleds, we were doing whatever we could to try to skateboard. on skis. We even had, again, Lovett, which was the John Lovett in Boulder. He invented the fiberglass ski. There was a company called Kryptonics in Boulder that was a mining wheel company who then made skateboard wheels, and then John Lovett actually pressed skateboards with P-Tex bottoms, and we used to ride those on the local hills. Before, again, we had seen snowboards, so we were really into this idea of skateboarding on snow, and that was our generation's thing, my brother and I, and we were just infatuated. So that was one of my early days on a real snowboard at Chautauqua. If you saw the whole picture, there's flat irons in the background and all that. So again, it kind of comes back to this ecosystem that was going on in Boulder of skiing and outdoor and ski wear and ski equipment and all this kind of stuff. And so Boulder became this real early hotbed of snowboarding. I started working at a skateboard shop, and we talked them into selling snowboards called Wave Rave. That was me, I think I was 16, something like that. So I started working there in 1985. And because we didn't know you couldn't just make clothes, and we didn't know you couldn't just start companies because it was ingrained in us from early age, we talked Brett and Sandy, the people that owned Wave Rave, into actually making clothes. There was still a clothing industry in Boulder at the time. You could go down the street and have things made. So we actually said, the snowboarding thing's really getting big. There's only a couple companies making things, so why don't we just do that? And so Wave Rave became one of the biggest global snowboard apparel companies in the early days.
I just want to interject because this kind of local story and the way that kind of the personal connections and knowledge matter to the origins is in sharp contrast to what happens around the same time with the companies that we were just discussing. So the corporatization of the outdoor industry is happening concurrently with what Trent's describing in a really interesting way. Many of the companies with mail order expertise become targets of buyouts. And so General Mills buys Eddie Bauer in the early 1970s. Similarly, Gillette Corporation is the one that buys out Frostline. And Johnson Wax is the one that buys out
Hollybar first.
Hollybar, right? And so, in other words, this trend of kind of considering the local skill, expertise, and reputation of these companies as something that could be beneficial to a broader portfolio repeats itself over and over again. And so what it means at the very same time, as Trent is saying, he could talk with the people he worked with and go down the street and have something made and then sell it to a burgeoning market. The expertise and the kind of personal connection and drive for the love of the sport that had helped to buoy Hollybar, Jerry, and other similar companies, Frostline, to really prominence nationally in the 1970s began to disappear. Not that the stuff was immediately not good, but rather that if it was MBAs leading these companies because they worked for General Mills, part of what was lost was that notion that it's athletes, right, who are also the ones selling the gear to athletes. And so I think what's remarkable about what you're describing is that culture remains in this era, but not in their original outdoor companies that kind of had the broadest national reputation around the same time period.
No, that's exactly right. I remember the day my dad came home and said that Frostline had sold to Gillette, and he came carrying a big box of this shampoo called Lemon Up. It was like a case of shampoo, and I was so confused. I had no idea what was going on. And there were these yellow bottles, and the caps were little lemons. I'll never forget this, and I'm just like, what does this have to do with all the things that I know? And it had nothing to do with it. They cashed out. And the Johnson Wax, I don't know what it was with all these home chemical companies wanting to buy outdoor companies at the time. But Johnson Wax then sold to Hollybar to North Face early on. And so all the Hollybar stores, and I think that was one of the reasons North Face bought it, because they had all these stores long before North Face had all their stores, so that they pretty quickly transitioned all the stores from Hollybar to North Face. So again, it's hard to overstate the importance of these early companies. They just happened to be here, and they just happened to be sort of mom and pop-ish, but they were so unbelievably important to the greater outdoor years. So again, not knowing you couldn't make things. I think the other big point, actually thinking about it now, the offshoring of product was the other big downfall of the kit companies, because all of a sudden people were making things in Asia, and it was significantly less expensive then to buy something that was built better. You didn't have to do it yourself. You could just go in, try it on, buy it, and you didn't have to do the 400-hour parka sort of a mentality.
The final reason that I've read about is that at least some marketing manager from Hollybar said it was women's lib that killed the kits, because they realized they didn't want to have to spend their time sewing for other people. And I don't know how much credit to put in that, but at least that was the insight of one outdoor industry professional.
Yeah, well, it was the women who got those companies to really get established and keep going, so we have a lot to be thankful for there. I'll just talk through this real quick. I mean, just kind of my journey. I started my own brand called Twist. My brother and a friend Amani and I, we were at Boulder High. So again, that idea of just being able to start something. And my mom, there's in the snowboard section back here, there's a mannequin with some of the stuff we made. But there's a polar fleece jacket that became our first thing that we made, and my mom sewed it because she had the sewing machine and she had the skills. So it was really cool. We actually grew that company. Again, I was 19, I think, when we started it. Grew it to be one of the biggest snowboard apparel companies in the world, actually, at the time, second to Burton, behind the leader, at least in specialty store penetration. It was a really, really cool company. We did a lot of really edgy things for the time. Not only were we a snowboarding company trying to finance it and do all these different things, and we had bank managers asking us if we had livestock as collateral and all kinds of things. So it was a beg, borrow, steal thing, because we were a bunch of kids. The bigger brands that became, Volcom, or these brands that from the or DC or whatever, those brands didn't exist. There were no kids literally out making outdoor or snowboard companies or companies of any sort. And again, for us, it was just second nature. We were early in sponsoring athletes. We were early supporting the women's side of snowboarding. That's now my wife up there in the picture. But Tina Bassett, Shannon Dunn, Lisa Vincent-Guerra, these are like the early pioneers in women's snowboarding. So we were pretty proud for Twist to be the first brand in snowboarding before Burton, before Sims, before anybody that actually made women's snowboard apparel, which was, again, because not only did we sponsor them, but my girlfriend at the time was a competitive snowboarder, and if she watches this, she'll be mad at me for saying it, but I always say it's the most expensive pair of pants I ever gave away, because I sponsored her for the US Open in 1991. So long story short, Twist became this big global success. We had multiple brand pieces with it. Twist was the men's brand, Tuesday was a women's brand. We grew huge, and it all came tumbling down in 1996 when the Japanese economy fell apart, because we were actually financed by that time after all the begging, borrowing, stealing to try to get financing to get the growth for a bunch of snowboarders who have typos on their first slide. We didn't know what we were doing, so we lost the brand. What a sort of interesting thing, I was, if you guys know SIA, it was Snowsports Industries of America. It was kind of the governing body of the ski industry for many, many years. I ended up being on the board of directors of that really early on. It was really cool, because it was my heroes, because snowboard heroes didn't really exist yet, but Klaus Obermeyer and David Jacobs from Spider, all ththese people that you hear about when you're growing up, especially in Colorado and with the ski heritage and all that stuff. And the other guy that was on there representing snowboarding was Jake Burton, so from Burton Snowboards. And so we got to be really good friends. When Twist imploded or exploded or whatever the term is, Jake called 2 weeks later. He's like, is it really over? We're like, oh yeah, it's over. My wife had a paper out to pay our rent. And so he called my brother and I in to see if we wanted to go run the soft goods and all the apparel for Burton Snowboards, which was really cool, because for us it was a chance to to do what we're doing at a truly global scale, in the hundreds of millions of dollars instead of just the millions of dollars sort of range, which is cool. The problem was we didn't really like the clothes that they were making, so we sort of did Twist Part 2, and we started a brand that was called Analog. So if anybody's a snowboarder, they probably know that name. did that for a number of years. Decided it was time to go back on our own because we really loved everything around the culture. Because when we grew up, especially in the Frostline thing, it was all culture. It was hippie 70s and the whole thing, and we missed that about Twist. At Burton, we were just in analog. We were just designing clothing. So came back to Boulder. Actually, I was there the whole time, but we went back and forth to Vermont. And I got to be really good friends with David Jacobs again from Spider when we were on the board of directors at SIA. And so my brother and myself and David Jacobs started a snowboard company called Section with a local kid, Mark Frank Montoya, and a bunch of people. And that then turned into a company that we supported that was started here in Vail called Tech 9. So we've just, the snowboarding thing for me was a total extension of everything I knew. And it was that same sort of spirit and mentality of just sort of take no prisoners, do exactly what you want to do, and figure it out as you go along. And that was really interesting. I did get a little tired of trying to sell cheap jackets to 16-year-old boys for over time, and I really got interested in human performance. And a lot of that actually, it harkens back to what you were talking about Jerry in particular, about the layering thing and all of the work that they were doing with the military at the time. And I really got interested in human performance and human apparel systems. So I sort of started transitioning. I was still doing a lot of stuff in snowboarding, but what I really sort of started focusing on, besides little micro brands in the Colorado market, was actually getting involved here at the museum. So I was beating down the door in the 90s to try to get snowboarding to be sort of covered here in the museum when it was the Colorado Ski Museum. Finally broke through. Susie Josem gave me a great opportunity to come in and really tell the snowboard history, which is actually, if you guys have a chance, if you've never looked, we have snowboards going back into the 30s. It goes way earlier than a lot of people know. And so this was this real opportunity to take what I had seen in my dad. My dad was my hero. And I got to see how people in his life affected him before. And for me, a lot of those people were the people who started the snowboard industry, and they became my heroes. So I really wanted to make sure there was a way to capture their stories, tell their stories, and this was the place to do it. So I got really involved, put together the whole snowboard exhibit, and really got super deep into that over the years. But in the sort of performance side of things, I was working with Outdoor Research and Marmot, Oakley, Hestra. I mean, so many different brands in the outdoor space, just trying to sort of figure out this higher performance outdoor situation. Working with Phoenix Outdoor, which is Fjallraven, a bunch of those brands, and I ended up becoming vice president global product at Mountain Hardwear, which was a very interesting story because they were kind of one of those brands that came out of the Jerry and Holly Bar and Frostline via North Face pathways. So after that, I was a VP of product at Black Diamond, which again worked really well into the sort of climbing heritage and history and outdoor history. And I was commuting for a number of years from Boulder to San Francisco and Boulder to Salt Lake to do those jobs. Wanting to get back to Colorado, I actually came back and did a second run with Spider, with the parent company that ran Spider. And it's so weird, these parallels through life and in Rachel's work. It's so funny because I keep discovering more and more things that I thought I was making up or doing or whatever, and it's all been done before me, all the trailblazers. So I was fortunate enough to work with Spider to create the 2022 Olympic uniform program, which was really fun and interesting because it was a chance to take sort of streetwear culture and snowboard culture and those kinds of things and actually bring that into the ski world. So we worked with a guy named Eric Hayes, who is a very famous graffiti artist from the early graffiti days, and we brought that into the 2022 Beijing Olympic uniform. So I got to make my own slope coat, which is pretty funny, not knowing really that there was one before. So that's been quite a ride. And so where that sort of to kind of tie it all together, and again talking about those influences and those things that I've done, that I've been fortunate enough to do through all this time, I always, the twist years and the wave rave years, those early years were like magic for me. And they were family and community and our own little world that we were creating, and I really wanted to get back to that. So I decided to create a new brand from the ground up called Artelect, which is just kind of equal parts art and intelligence is sort of the mentality. But taking a lot of those early roots, the work Jerry did in layering and create a modern outdoor and backcountry brand, really with that skin through the environment sort of systems-based approach, but really starting ground up for equal parts men and women as well, really taking care of the conditions and the cold and the wind and the rain and the snow and all that stuff, keeping that out, but then really as most outdoor activities have become much more physical over the last few decades, really taking care of the moisture and heat created inside as well. So and again, those parallels, it's wild. So the brand, we're based in Boulder. We do all that stuff. But one of the other side projects I just did, I created a guide, me and a couple guys in Boulder for the U.S. Air Force, for Air Force Research Labs, which is a reference guide in how to dress in cold conditions. Which again, going back, it's again, I learned that from Rachel's books about the early military side of things. And it was just really cool that I was able to have our group be tapped because of our experience, and that experience that goes back almost generations is just deeply held to teach not only the Air Force, the Air Force community, the special operators, USOCOM, the ECWIC system, all of this stuff that's given and given out to all the people. It comes in a big box. Their apparel system, they don't know how to wear it. So we got to spend last couple of years actually creating guides to teach people how to dress in cold conditions. It was pretty interesting.
I know we're going to want to turn to questions in just a moment, but I wanted to wrap up by pointing out a really important connection between the fascinating kind of story that Trent has shared and that earlier history that I offered in the first half of the talk. And that is that we could tell a history of snow sports and more broadly outdoor recreation gear and clothing by looking at technology, which is to say, we could say this person invented this in this date and they were earlier than that other one, and we could show you the patents and the drawings from the original kind of ideas and how that transformed when it finally hit the consumer market. But we didn't do any of that, and that's because kind of both of our contention is that to understand the importance of the outdoor recreation world, right? The athletes, the professionals and amateurs alike, the industry professionals, and the sports that they're all a part of, you have to understand them embedded in the culture, right? And so what we've done is share stories, right, narratives about the history of products and the people who are associated with them, because that, more than any single item and the year it was invented, is the way that you understand how this shared interest that we all have, right, some version of a love for the big outdoors out there and what we can all do with it in our bodies in exciting ways when we're out there. Understanding that is far more about kind of seeing where does the power of it come from, where is the kind of shared identity, where is the knowledge sharing happening, and that's not a story of just things were invented, but rather people created this culture all together, and we are the ones who can continue to shape it. So thank you all. Thank you, Trent, for this, and I think we will now turn to folks and their questions.
Question is, just curious if back in the World War II days, did Brad Washburn come up in your research?
Yeah, and if someone else wants to grab the mic if they have a question next. Yeah, so an important part of the initial kind of set of people doing inquiries into how are we going to have a cold weather fighting unit and equipment and clothing to supply them and keep them alive were the Harvard Five. So a set of mountaineers, all of whom had been a part of the mountaineering club at Harvard College, who went on to be kind of professionals in different industries but continued to climb. And Brad Washburn was one among those who worked for the Quartermaster Corps, right? I mean, I think that's important because, again, part of what I'm suggesting is that the 10th Mountain Division story has been shared so much because ski troopers are cool, right? Like, it's a sexy topic, and it's one very worth returning to over and over again. But actually, Washburn and his contemporaries had a much bigger influence because it was kind of his former mountaineering buddies who were the ones doing the military education courses. They were called indoctrination classes, basically sharing the World War II version of this, right? There's a photograph of a mountaineer who went to Southeast Asia to speak to American soldiers about the cold weather fighting system and how to layer with the M43 uniform. And it's remarkable because they're all in tank tops and sitting under palm trees as they're learning about how to do this. And so, yes, absolutely, he's a really big part of that story, and I think it points again to how broad their influence was. Other questions?
One thing I just want to bring up that I thought was so cool is that you talked about a little bit about Yvon Chouinard. And, you know, Patagonia is such a beloved company because he's giving back and doing so much. Like, you actually feel good. Like, you feel good when you buy a down coat. Right? You're like, how does that make you feel good? You know, but he has somehow, because he's doing the right thing, I think. And so that's kind of an interesting conundrum in this day and age of what's going on in all the other industries.
As Trent suggested, part of what you might get from reading more history of the outdoors is that, oh, this stuff has a much longer tail than you might expect. And so I agree with that reflection on kind of there are some contemporary brands that might kind of have the ethos of doing good in some way. Actually, in the 1970s, there were a whole lot of companies where the folks who led them were taking very seriously kind of the rise of popular environmentalism and realizing that how they sold their products and what they sold was at odds with what they believed politically, and they wanted to do business differently. And so we see a lot of models of alternative business in the 1970s, and that might be something that seems small now, but the outdoor industry was one of the first places to think about the waste of their products and kind of how they might do things differently when it comes to not necessarily offering bags every time you sold, or organizing political campaigns with their consumers. REI, the co-op in Seattle, helped to lead a fight to preserve a certain part of wilderness in Washington State, which is unusual in the 1970s because it's not usually companies that are leading that as much as clubs, right? And actually the industry, not just the kind of participatory clubs for people who already are like-minded, was a real leader in that time of pushing for a broader political involvement from the outdoor industry, and it was partly consumers who were asking that of their companies. And so you're bringing up a more contemporary example, but part of what this research shows is that there were visions of how to do this more than 50 years ago, which I think is remarkable.
Yeah, and Jerry Cunningham in particular was early proponent of just enough, using just enough stuff. He was an early proponent of clean climbing. You know, same with holly bars, you know, pitons and instead of fixed protection and those kinds of things, you know, trying to actually take the environment sort of into the conversation, as you said. The thing that is really interesting from your book, and I don't remember what brand it was, but if you guys know one of the more recent Patagonia sort of taglines, you know, it's "We are not fashion." And I was driving, I sent you a picture of that because the Patagonia store in Boulder, big giant thing, "We are not fashion." And it was exactly the tagline of somebody in the 30s or the 40s. So again, things, they happen and they repeat and they happen over and over. And those same themes that we all think are pretty modern now actually have been told and retold many, many times. I think the one thing that is really interesting right now, and you talked a little bit about technology, and so my day job is deep in technology, especially in clean chemistries and those kinds of things. The big drivers now in the outdoor industry, of course, and the ski industry environmentalism is a huge topic. If we wreck everything that we love, we'll have nowhere to do these things anymore. The biggest, I think the second biggest contributor to global to pollution and all kinds of things is the apparel industry in general. Fast fashion doesn't help, but really petroleum-based, chemical-laden apparel products also don't help a lot. And so there's a lot going on right now in the outdoor industry and the ski industry around PFAS, which is a forever chemical. It's Teflon. You guys will hear about PFAS if you haven't heard about it already. It's the thing that the Gore-Tex membrane is made out of. So that's actually being the original Gore-Tex membrane is now phased out and banned, will be globally. And so it's exciting for me in particular to be able to, how can we actually increase performance and sustainability at the same time? So we work on all kinds of things. One of the best outcomes of all of this is the return to natural fibers. And if you see in the old ski stuff, the cruiser jacket, what was it called?
The Stag Cruiser.
The Stag Cruiser. I mean, wool's the best, and so we, at Artelect, we actually founded it with work we were doing with U.S. 10th Special Forces in cold weather preparedness and base layer and merino in particular. So we really believe wholeheartedly in natural fibers, in actually allowing them to do what they're intended to do and sort of supercharging them. The same thing with our hard shell and our down products and all those. We actually have a lot of really cool new and next technology. So it's a really interesting era right now in the outdoor and ski space, and we're looking at innovation and technology. And the other thing I'm working to do, which is super funny, I'm working to actually make the cord lock not necessary anymore. I'm working with YKK, the big zipper company. We have a bunch of projects going right now, so it's just, again, kind of wild that the cord lock was invented in Boulder, and I kind of hope to make it not happen anymore, and we're doing that there too. So.
Other questions? Okay, well, I'll offer something just to close out the conversation. When I started this research 15 years ago, I had to travel to small collections all over the country because there was no main hub of where you could find information about the outdoor industry's past. That's actually changed since I started this project. I think there's far more recognition that the history of the industry, of the companies, the people who participated, the consumers, matters very deeply, and that if we don't capture it, right, in important spaces like this to interpret it, but also in libraries and in archives and other kinds of corporate collections, then we won't have access to it later. And these are very necessary stories to tell, not just because I find them compelling, but also because they're useful for business, right? Like, knowing your history is important for the bottom line, and a lot of companies, since I've started this research, have started archives because they're realizing that it actually matters a lot to recognize their own brand heritage. And so I wanted to just point that out to say that there is more work than ever being done on the history of outdoor sports, outdoor products, and the outdoor industry as a whole. Trent and I share an interest in preserving the story of Colorado outdoor industry in particular, with a focus on Boulder as this hub of innovation, and we think kind of there are legs for a history documentary that will capture more of this story. So I'm sure we'll be happy to talk more about that if anyone has interest later after we're all done. But more importantly, I think that it's why spaces like this are so important, because there's a recognition that these stories ought to be captured, and that though it seems like we're talking about leisure interests, like the stuff you do for fun before you return to the serious things, that actually outdoor sports is a way into some very important questions and gets at really important aspects of business history or identity or the nation's history in relationship to the U.S. military. And so I just want to acknowledge that your leisure time interests are of great value, right, to the people here, but also to the many visitors who come to this institution and more broadly who come to a place like Vail. And so the more we can do to share those stories collectively, I think the more power they will continue to have. So thank you again. I don't know if, Jen, you want to say any closing words. All right, thanks, everyone.
Thank you.